this is also a time of change for my family.
I watched the monarch read that opening page once. Then he read it again. He couldn't believe what was sitting right in front of his eyes. The language inside that submission was sharp, precise, and deeply clinical. It did not sound like a family member reaching out to offer a helping hand. It described the sacred covenant as an initiative in desperate need of an active, globally recognized woman who could expand its reach far beyond the borders of Great Britain. But hidden beneath those polished public relations buzzwords was a devastating, covert attack. The document explicitly referred to Catherine's reduced public schedule during her private medical recovery as proof of patronage vacancy and an active abandonment of royal duty. Let that sink in for a moment. It was 8 o'clock on a cold, grey London morning when the gold-embossed leather folio arrived at Clarence House. It looked like routine palace correspondence, the kind of administrative paperwork that flows through the royal household every single day without raising a single whisper. Private secretaries expected a polite, carefully worded proposal for cross-Atlantic charitable cooperation. They expected an olive branch, a diplomatic gesture meant to ease years of bitter family friction. But the moment King Charles opened that sealed binder, the air in the room completely shifted. The temperature dropped. The quiet murmur of morning staff evaporated into a heavy, suffocating silence. Page 1 changed everything. It was not a request for peace. It was a calculated, formal legal demand. Meghan Markle had not simply written to offer her support to the crown. She had formally demanded total control over the Queen's covenant for children and families. This was not just another charitable cause sitting on a palace spreadsheet. It was a protected royal patronage, sealed by the late Queen Elizabeth II herself, guarded by centuries of strict palace tradition, and strictly forbidden from ever being transferred to anyone outside the active working royal household. A mother, recovering quietly behind closed doors, protecting her children while rebuilding her physical health, was being framed in a legal filing as having abandoned her sacred trust. To Meghan, Catherine's silence wasn't a time for family empathy. It was an operational opening. It was a weakness to be exploited. Charles removed his reading glasses, his hands visibly unsteady, and pressed his fingers firmly against his forehead. He looked around the room at his senior aides. "She has crossed the boundary," he whispered into the silent room, the one she was warned never to approach. The king was no stranger to public scandals, explosive television interviews, or bitter family feuds. But this was different. This wasn't just ambition leaking into the press. This was an organized, legal challenge directed straight at the heart of the future Queen's dignity. When Prince William received the news at Adelaide Cottage, he listened in total silence. He didn't interrupt the private secretary delivering the brief. He didn't raise his voice. But when the secretary admitted that Meghan's formal filing had explicitly classified Catherine's role as vacant, William's composure cracked. He looked over at his wife. Catherine repeated the word softly, almost as if she couldn't process the sheer coldness of it. Vacant? In that single, quiet moment, the hurt settled deep behind her incredible restraint. Meghan had taken Catherine's most vulnerable personal season and turned it into evidence that she could be replaced. Hi, viewers. Do you think Meghan had any right to ask for Catherine's role while Catherine was sick? Or did she cross a line? Hit that subscribe button and join our community right here as this story unfolds. The king felt a second, far deeper shock as he continued to study the specific legal wording of the submission. This wasn't just a haphazard letter written over a weekend in California. Several highly key phrases inside the document matched a restricted, confidential palace memorandum word for word. Specifically, it cited a dormant continuity clause, a deeply obscure, rarely used administrative rule governing temporary stewardship during a sudden royal absence. That material was top secret. It sat in restricted archives. It was never, under any circumstances, meant for outside hands. Someone high up inside the old palace infrastructure had supplied Meghan with the confidential language. Someone with master clearance to restricted historical records had helped her construct this strike. The request was no longer just an audacious family overreach. It was an insider betrayal. A mole was operating inside the institutional walls. Before Charles could even draft a preliminary response, the heavy doors of Clarence House swung open. Prince William arrived without an appointment. He carried no files, no briefs, and no legal summaries. His jaw was set. His eyes were burning with a terrifying, quiet fury. He looked his father dead in the eye, looked down at the gold-embossed folder sitting on the mahogany desk, and delivered a devastating 7-word truth. "She didn't write this alone," William said, his voice cut like steel. The leak came from inside. The room froze. What had started as an audacious demand for a charitable role was suddenly turning into a high-stakes investigation inside the sovereign's own house. 3 people stood at the epicenter of this storm, carrying 3 wildly different wounds. Catherine saw the covenant as a sacred promise made during the final, quiet months of Queen Elizabeth's life. Meghan viewed it as proof of a global platform she had been unfairly denied, and Charles sat caught right in the middle, staring at a massive family fracture he had spent years trying to heal, only to realize the wound was now bleeding out across the crown itself. The line had been drawn. The investigation was beginning, and the fight for Catherine's legacy had officially begun. To understand how a top-secret palace memorandum ended up on a desk in California, I had to trace the paper trail back to where this quiet conspiracy first took root. Windsor Castle, autumn of 2021. The late Queen Elizabeth II sat in her private sitting room, personally drafting what would become her final major administrative bequest, the Queen's Covenant for Children and Families. It was never meant to be a decorative title or a mere public relations exercise. It was a solemn, sacred trust. She placed the heavy silver emblem of the covenant directly into Catherine's hands, sealing it with a private written instruction. Lifelong service. Character over visibility. Absolute devotion to the next generation. Catherine earned that trust through years of quiet, meticulous work. She built the foundation brick by brick, far away from the flashing cameras. Fast forward to 6 months before that tense morning at Clarence House. Rain poured over the historic courtyard at St. James's Palace. Inside the grand picture gallery, high-ranking officials, wealthy donors, and senior palace staff gathered for the annual Covenant Assembly. Princess Anne stepped up to the wooden podium to deliver the keynote speech. She was speaking on Catherine's behalf. Why? Because the Princess of Wales was absent. She was at home, quietly undergoing medical recovery, protected from the relentless eyes of the world. Right in the front row sat a single, empty velvet chair. It remained untouched throughout the entire evening. It was meant to be a quiet sign of respect, a symbol that the role still belonged to Catherine, even in her physical absence. But someone in that room wasn't looking at that chair with respect. They were looking at it as an opening. Enter Sir Malcolm Avery, a former senior palace legal advisor who had spent decades drafting internal crown regulations. Avery was a man consumed by his own past importance. After the speeches ended, over glasses of wine in the long gallery, Avery began conversing with an American charity executive known to have direct ties to Montecito. Avery wanted to feel important. He wanted to prove he still held the keys to the castle, so he dropped a piece of restricted legal intelligence. He mentioned an obscure, hidden mechanism tucked deep inside the Covenant's founding bylaws, the Dormant Continuity Clause. It was a rarely used rule designed strictly for extreme administrative emergencies, a clause explaining how temporary stewardship could be assigned during an unmanageable royal absence. Avery thought he was just sharing fascinating legal trivia. He thought he was impressing an international guest. He was dead wrong. To the executive listening across the high-top table, those words weren't trivia. They were pure dynamic leverage. Within 48 hours, that private conversation made its way across 3,000 miles of ocean. It landed directly on Meghan's desk. She didn't hear administrative protocol. She heard opportunity. Photographs of Catherine's empty velvet chair began circulating among Meghan's private team of legal and public relations advisors. They analyzed those images like military strategists. They didn't see a beloved princess recovering from illness. They saw a perceived vacuum of power. Meghan argued that the palace was prioritizing sentimental tradition over active leadership. To her, Catherine's forced absence was proof that the patronage needed someone who could immediately take it global. But William was already putting the pieces together back in London. He quietly ordered a comprehensive forensic audit of all palace communication logs and digital security passes surrounding St. James's Palace. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. Meghan's legal representatives had contacted Sir Malcolm Avery 3 separate times following that evening. They weren't just asking general questions. They were requesting internal financial balance sheets, historical funding ledgers, and precise details regarding the Covenant's royal insignia. They were building their dossier for months. They were waiting for the exact moment Catherine was at her most vulnerable to strike. When King Charles learned of Avery's slip, he summoned the former advisor to Clarence House. The confrontation was terrifying in its quietness. Avery walked into the room leaning heavily on his dark wooden walking stick, completely unaware of what was coming. Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, in total silence. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his hand on the desk. He simply read the transcript of Avery's leaked conversation directly back to him. Avery's face drained of all color. His hands shook uncontrollably. When the king quietly ordered him to leave the room, the old advisor was so thoroughly rattled that he left his walking stick leaning against the leather armchair. Charles stared at that abandoned stick in absolute silence. One man's careless vanity had handed an ambitious outsider the very blueprint to attack the crown. Queen Camilla entered the study shortly after Avery was escorted out. She looked at the open file, then looked at her husband. Her voice was calm, but her warning was brutal. "It's a trap, Charles," she said softly. She laid out the cold reality. If Charles rejected Meghan's demand outright, Meghan's team could easily frame the narrative in the global press, accusing the king of blocking a passionate woman from helping vulnerable children out of petty palace spite. But if he approved the transfer, he would be publicly betraying Catherine, stripping her of her legacy while she was down, and breaking a direct promise made by Queen Elizabeth II. It was a checkmate move, or so they thought. Just as the weight of the dilemma seemed ready to crush the room, a senior page entered carrying a heavy mahogany box. It had come directly from the private vaults of Windsor Castle, sealed with dark red wax bearing the late Queen's personal cipher. Inside was a confidential document nobody in that room knew existed. A final, sealed order, written by Elizabeth II herself shortly before her death. What was written inside that secret box? And how did it completely obliterate Meghan's legal argument in a single stroke? You cannot afford to miss what happens next in our upcoming video, because the shocking details buried inside that final order reveal what Queen Elizabeth really thought about Meghan's royal ambitions, and the explosive showdown that followed will change everything you thought you knew about this battle for the crown. The heavy wooden box sitting on the mahogany table in Clarence House wasn't the only thing moving in the shadows that afternoon. 15 miles away, inside the quiet security perimeter of Adelaide Cottage, Prince William walked into the sunlit drawing room where Catherine sat. He didn't want to bring this poison into her sanctuary. He wanted to shield her. But in the cold world of institutional warfare, silence is a deadly liability. When William told her what Meghan had filed, Catherine didn't react with anger. She didn't yell. She didn't weep. She simply stood up, walked slowly toward the glass display cabinet in the corner of the room, and looked inside. Sitting on the top velvet shelf was the original silver emblem of the Queen's Covenant. It was a pristine piece of royal craftsmanship, hand-carved with delicate oak leaves and the late Queen's personal cipher. Elizabeth II had given it to her with a strict instruction: guard this with your life, because it represents the vulnerable who have no voice. Catherine touched the glass gently with her fingertips. How could someone look at a woman fighting for her health behind closed doors and conclude that her dedication was gone? How could a temporary, doctor-ordered absence be twisted into a legal claim of abandonment? To Catherine, it felt like a cold, calculated betrayal. Her vulnerability had been weaponized. Her quiet recovery had been surveyed from afar, measured like property value, and declared ripe for a takeover. I spoke with a senior household source who watched William leave Adelaide Cottage that afternoon. They told me his eyes were completely deadened by rage. He wasn't just defending a royal title anymore. He was defending his wife's honor. And then, the investigation uncovered something far worse. While Charles sat staring at the demand in London, Palace communications officers intercepted a hidden digital file circulating through high-level public relations channels in New York and Los Angeles. It was a fully designed, embargo-less press release. The header read, "A new global chapter for the Queen's Covenant." Think about that. Before King Charles had even finished reading the first page of Meghan's proposal, her external team had already written the victory statement. They had drafted the narrative. They had framed the handoff. And that wasn't all. William's security detail discovered that a prominent press photographer had already been hired and retained on standby outside a children's centre in South London. The plan was clear. Meghan intended to make an unannounced, high-profile public appearance at the centre, creating a massive wave of global headlines before the palace could even issue a formal statement. It was a classic media ambush. Force the king into a corner. Make the public believe the takeover was already happening. Make a refusal look bitter, petty, and cruel. Then came the revelation that broke the entire situation wide open. William pushed deeper into the digital logs provided by his contacts in the duchy. He uncovered a series of private email attachments sent from Montecito to high-net-worth international donors across North America. Inside those emails were high-resolution graphical mock-ups, drafts of fundraising brochures featuring the protected royal seal of the covenant, printed directly alongside commercial corporate logos. Meghan's team hadn't just asked for the patronage. They were actively selling it. They were pitching the late Queen's sacred legacy to foreign billionaires before the King of England had even signed off on the document. This was no longer just a family dispute over titles. It was a direct, unauthorized commercialization of the Crown's most protected emblem. Queen Camilla walked back into the King's private office at Clarence House as the sun began to dip below the London skyline. She didn't mince words. "Neutrality is poison, Charles," she warned him, her voice filled with absolute conviction. "If you hesitate now, you are telling the world that Catherine is fair game." Camilla knew how palace politics worked. She had survived decades of ruthless press scrutiny. She understood that in the arena of public perception, staying silent isn't viewed as dignified restraint. It is viewed as weakness. And weakness invites predators. Charles knew she was right. His instinct had always been to keep the peace, to leave the door cracked open for his youngest son, to avoid an explosive public war. But his hesitation was destroying the trust of the people standing right beside him. Catherine had given everything to the institution. William was standing on the precipice of open revolt. The king had to act. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, an unmarked black SUV pulled silently into the private courtyard behind Clarence House. No cameras, no reporters, no official royal diary announcement. Meghan Markle had arrived in London. She had bypassed every standard diplomatic protocol. She had rejected the offer to communicate through private secretaries or legal representatives. She demanded a face-to-face audience with the king himself, alone, behind closed doors. She believed she could persuade him. She believed her charisma, her polished arguments, and her global network of influence would force Charles to buckle. I watched the security feeds from the outer hallway as the king gave the order. Clear the room. Dismiss the aides. Lock the heavy timber doors. There would be no spin doctors in this meeting. No press handlers. No protective buffers. Just a king, his clear duty, and the woman who had tried to claim what belonged to his daughter-in-law. Meghan stepped across the threshold, carrying a dark leather folder, her expression calm, confident, and completely unbothered by the chaos she had unleashed. Charles did not stand up to greet her. He did not offer a smile. He waited until the heavy double doors clicked shut, locking out the entire world. He looked at her across the long, polished desk. The room was deathly quiet. You could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The king pushed his chair back, stood up to his full height, and looked her directly in the eyes. "You are asking for what was never yours," Charles said, his voice quiet, cold, and razor-sharp. "And you are using Catherine's pain as your ladder. What happened in the next 10 minutes inside that locked room was never supposed to leave Clarence House. You cannot afford to miss what comes next, in our very next video. Because the moment Meghan tried to defend her actions, the heavy doors opened unannounced, and Princess Anne walked into the room holding a long-lost leather binder that contained a brutal, handwritten directive from Queen Elizabeth II. A single sentence that stripped Meghan of her final defense and brought this entire conspiracy crashing down to the floor. The atmosphere inside the king's private study at Clarence House felt impossibly dense. High ceilings, dark oak paneling, and the faint scent of aged leather created an environment built for centuries of quiet power. Sunlight filtered through the grand arched windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished mahogany conference table. Meghan sat on one side, opening her dark leather folio with absolute composure. She did not flinch under the king's heavy gaze. She didn't hesitate. Instead, she began presenting her case with the calm, fluid poise of a seasoned high-stakes negotiator. She spoke of global scale. She spoke of modernizing royal charitable efforts, securing multi-million-dollar commitments from major North American philanthropic foundations, and launching a high-impact media campaign for a cause she claimed was languishing in obscurity. To her, this wasn't an act of aggression. It was an essential modernization. She argued that traditional palace restraint was failing vulnerable children. She insisted that historic protocol had to give way to international results. I watched the king sit in complete, eerie silence. His hands were clasped tightly on the desk. His brow was furrowed deep. He let her speak without interruption for 4 long, agonizing minutes. Then, he delivered a question that shattered the room. Why was Catherine not consulted before this document was filed? Pause. The silence that followed was terrifying. Meghan didn't blink. She adjusted her posture slightly, her voice dropping into a cold, clinical cadence. "Permission is not required," she said smoothly, "from an individual whose inactivity created the absolute necessity for outside intervention." Let those words sink into your mind. Inactivity. She didn't call it a medical recovery. She didn't call it a mother healing behind closed doors. She looked at a princess fighting for her life and classified it as mere inactivity. Charles pushed his heavy leather chair backward. The wooden legs scraped against the parquet floor with a sharp, piercing screech. The quiet restraint vanished from his eyes. His voice shook, not with hesitation, but with a sudden, overwhelming fury. "You stand in my home," Charles said, leaning across the table, "asking for what was never yours, and you dare to use Catherine's suffering to justify taking it." He reminded her that stepping back to heal is not surrender. Reduced public duty is not abandonment. Catherine had stepped into the quiet shadows to rebuild her body and protect her young children, not to yield her sacred life's work to someone who viewed royal duty as a competitive trophy. Meghan tried to regain control of the room. She pivoted. She brought up a recorded conversation from years past, a moment when Prince Harry believed Queen Elizabeth II had intended to grant them an expansive, global Commonwealth role. She claimed this application was simply correcting a historic injustice, reclaiming a platform that the institution had quietly denied her when she left official service. She thought that argument was her ultimate trump card. She believed evoking the late Queen would force Charles to soften his stance. She was completely wrong, because Charles held a devastating truth she had never been told. "My mother did consider your role in that covenant," Charles revealed, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying tone. "And after watching you blend royal status with private commercial ventures, she personally took a fountain pen, drew a line through your name, and removed you from the succession framework forever." Meghan's expression froze, the color drained from her face. For one single second, the impenetrable, polished armor cracked wide open. She didn't know. She had spent years believing that low-level palace bureaucrats had blocked her ambitions, never realizing that it was Queen Elizabeth II herself who had signed her exclusion order. Before she could process the revelation, the heavy bronze latch on the double doors clicked. The doors swung open. Catherine walked into the study. She didn't wear royal regalia or ceremonial jewels. She wore a simple, sharply tailored dark suit. Her face was pale, but her posture was straight as iron. Beside her stood Prince William, his broad shoulders filling the doorway behind her, his eyes cold and fixed on the table. An absolute, breathless silence fell over the room. Meghan turned, caught completely off guard. Catherine didn't raise her voice. She didn't display anger. She walked slowly to the edge of the mahogany table, looked directly down at the woman who had described her as inactive, and asked one simple, devastating question. "Why did you tell the world my work was abandoned when you knew I was fighting for my health?" Meghan opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The entire strategy had relied on operating in the dark, fighting through external legal teams, leaked memorandums and media pressure, while Catherine remained isolated at home. Now, forced to face Catherine in person, the slick corporate arguments dissolved into meaningless noise. Then, the heavy sound of measured footsteps echoed down the outer corridor. Princess Anne stepped into the room. Walking directly behind her was the keeper of the Privy Seal, carrying a thick red leather binder fastened with brass latches, the official vault ledger of the British Crown. Anne did not offer greetings. She didn't glance at the lingering tension. She unlatched the heavy binder, flipped to a page marked with a yellow silk ribbon, and began reading aloud in her crisp, unyielding voice. It was Queen Elizabeth II's final, unredacted instruction regarding the Covenant for Children and Families. The words resonated off the high-paneled walls like a hammer hitting an anvil. "The principal stewardship of this covenant," Anne read, "is entrusted eternally to Catherine, Princess of Wales. No authority, patronage, or royal seal connected to this trust shall ever pass to any individual who has chosen to exit active service to the Crown, nor shall it be granted to anyone who seeks to combine royal authority with commercial branding." Anne paused. She looked up over the top of the binder, her eyes locking onto Meghan. "That is not a flexible guideline," Anne said with lethal clarity. "That is an ironclad command written by the sovereign. It survives changing reigns, family pressure, and private ambition." The trap had closed. Every legal argument Meghan's team had meticulously built over 6 months, the dormant clause, the international donor pledges, the global expansion framework, was instantly erased by a single sheet of paper signed by the late Queen before her passing. Meghan realized the brutal reality. There was no legal loophole. There was no administrative backdoor. The lock had been set years ago, and the key belonged exclusively to Catherine. Charles stood up and walked toward the tall arched windows. He looked out over the gardens of Clarence House, taking a deep, heavy breath before turning back to face the room. He didn't yell. He didn't issue threats. He walked over to the velvet curtains, grabbed the heavy gold tassels, and pulled them closed, blotting out the afternoon light. He looked at Meghan one last time, "There will be no negotiation over my mother's promise," Charles said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable finality. "The answer is no." The confrontation was over. The audacious demand was dead. But as Meghan walked out of Clarence House in total silence, an explosive new threat was already developing in the dark. A rogue source inside the palace had just leaked the entire rejected application directly to an international television newsroom. You cannot afford to miss what happens next in our final video, because when the secret details of Meghan's rejected takeover break across global broadcasts tomorrow morning, a massive public reaction sweeps across Britain, forcing King Charles, William, and Catherine into a final, dramatic showdown that will permanently redefine the future of the British monarchy. By sunrise, the 6-paragraph official refusal had been formally served. It was brief, it was clinical, it was absolute. Meghan's access to royal archives was permanently revoked. Every informal discussion connected to the covenant was frozen. Palace security officers moved swiftly behind closed doors to seize and destroy every unauthorized promotional draft bearing the crown emblem. Inside her temporary London residence, Meghan read the final paragraph, placed her phone face down on the marble counter, and stared silently out the window into the grey morning fog. The humiliation sat deep beneath every word. Harry asked her a single question she had spent weeks avoiding. Had she truly expected his father to strip Catherine of her sacred duty? Meghan didn't answer, because the truth was far too bitter to speak aloud. She hadn't just miscalculated palace law. She had miscalculated the moral weight of Catherine's silence. And then, the scandal exploded into the open sky. A copy of the rejected application, leaked by a suspended palace contact hours earlier, landed directly on the news desks of every major broadcasting studio in London. Headlines screamed across morning newspapers. Television anchors debated the shocking wording of Meghan's filing. The nation learned that Catherine's reduced public appearances during her quiet medical recovery had been framed as inactivity and abandonment. The public outrage was immediate. It was deafening. People didn't care about corporate donor metrics or international expansion strategies. They saw a beloved princess being targeted while she was recovering from illness. They saw a woman who had served quietly for over a decade being told she was replaceable. Meghan's public relations strategy had attempted to force a surrender through media pressure. Instead, they had created a global wave of fierce, unshakable support for Catherine. Later that afternoon, a quiet meeting took place inside Windsor Castle. No advisors, no legal teams, no cameras, just King Charles and Catherine, sitting together in the quiet library. Charles offered his deepest apologies. He admitted that his delay, his desire to avoid a public war with his son, had allowed Meghan's demand to advance far enough to inflict real emotional pain. He knew his hesitation had created doubt where there should have been ironclad certainty. Catherine listened quietly. Then, she asked for something that completely stunned the king. She didn't ask for a public statement condemning Meghan. She didn't ask for legal retaliation or personal revenge. She asked for a permanent rewrite of the Covenant Charter itself. I read the handwritten draft of that request. Catherine wanted a new, unbreakable rule written into royal law. No future monarch, legal loophole, or external claimant could ever interpret a royal's illness, pregnancy, family duty, or temporary medical absence as abandonment of trust. Pause. She wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting every royal woman who would come after her. She was transforming her own season of suffering into an eternal shield for the institution. Charles looked at her, deeply moved, and reached across the table to take her hand. He signed the revised charter on the spot, sealing it with the royal signet ring. The loophole was closed forever. Sir Malcolm Avery was stripped of his advisory access and permanently barred from entering palace archives. The dormant continuity clause was scrubbed from Crown bylaws. An hour later, Catherine arrived at the South London Children's Centre for her first full public engagement. Thousands of citizens lined the streets outside. As her car door opened and she stepped onto the pavement, a wave of loud, thunderous applause erupted through the air. It echoed down the block. Catherine stopped in her tracks. She looked at the massive, cheering crowd, visibly moved, and placed her hand gently over her heart. The judgment of Great Britain had been delivered, not through legal briefs or secret filings, but through the overwhelming love of the people. Meghan left London quietly, unannounced, and without the triumphant press release she had spent months preparing. Her ambitious bid had failed completely. That evening, Charles visited Catherine at Adelaide Cottage. He didn't mention Meghan. He didn't mention the leaked files or the media frenzy. He simply looked at the Princess of Wales and spoke 4 quiet words. "The promise is safe." Catherine smiled softly. "Then the work can continue." The attempted takeover was officially over. Catherine retained her sacred patronage permanently, and the crown proved that true loyalty can never be bought or demanded. But just as quiet returned to the palace, an unbelievable secret surface document was discovered in the private estate records of Balmoral Castle. A draft letter, written by Prince Harry himself, just 3 days after this showdown, containing a desperate, hidden plea to his father that changes the entire future of the Sussex dynamic forever. You cannot afford to miss what comes next in our very next video, because we have obtained the exclusive, unredacted contents of that secret Balmoral letter, and what Harry begged Charles to do behind closed doors will leave you completely speechless.